8 years ago, we filed a missing persons report for my daughter. Amy was 15. "Chris, we need to call the police." I struggled to keep my voice calm, but one of us needed to keep our heads. Chris was panicking, and he paced around, holding his head. No, he moaned. "Chris, stop! Look at me!" I grabbed both his arms, as tightly as I could, to stop his pacing. I tried to look in his eyes, but he looked everywhere except at me. "We will call the police. We will file a report. They will know what to do, and they will help us," I said firmly. That seemed to snap him out of his trance. He had stopped pacing and nodded a couple of times, muttering to himself. Amy told us she was going to Melissa's house right after school, and she told Melissa she would walk home. When we called Melissa's parents in a panic, they said Amy insisted on walking home that night. They offered to drive her, or call me to come get her, but she didn't want them to. She walked out their front door, told Melissa she would see her at school the next day, and that was it. That was the last time anyone saw her. Chris arrived home before me. He asked me if Amy was with me. I could see in his eyes he was panicked before I even answered. "Chris, what's wrong?" I asked, putting down the groceries I had picked up on my way home from work. The way he was acting immediately filled me with dread. My heartbeat quickened, and I feared the worst. "It's Amy. She's not here, and her phone is on her bed. You know she doesn't go anywhere without that thing. Her school bag isn't... I don't think she ever came home from school." "Okay, well, maybe she just forgot it today. I'll call Melissa's house and see if she's there. Just try to breathe, okay, honey?" I said, trying to soothe him. But when Melissa's parents told us Amy had left, it brought Chris to the verge of tears. So, we called the police, and they did help us, sort of. After an exhausting, anxiety-ridden year of investigating, the police came up with nothing. They could establish a timeline before Amy went missing, but not after. It was like she vanished without a single trace. They looked into every possible scenario and questioned me about my relationship with Amy. I told them the truth, that we had a rocky start and now we'd worked our way up to a mutual respect. I confided in them that I thought Amy and I would never be best friends, but things were mostly amiable. She was a moody teenager after all. When they asked why I didn't pick Amy up after school, I told them we'd actually had an argument about it that day. I offered to drive to Melissa's after work, but Amy said she would walk home. I told her I'd feel better if I drove her, so I knew she would be safe, but Amy rolled her eyes and muttered something about me not being her real mom. Amy and I usually got along. She typically had a cool demeanor towards me, but I could feel she always harbored some resentment about having to live in my house. She had been rolling her eyes and huffing at me more lately, but I chalked that up to just being a teenager. They went over everything with a fine-tooth comb. They questioned everyone in Melissa's neighborhood. They even brought out the dogs to search the roads, but all their efforts came up with nothing. There was not a single clue where she went or what happened to her. The police returned the evidence they'd collected. There was nothing more they could do. We returned to Amy's things to her room. For the next 7 years, we kept it exactly how she left it, like some sort of shrine willing Amy to come home. We even left her phone on her bed, in the same position it had been when she disappeared. The police had thoroughly searched it and drained most of the battery, but because she didn't have her phone with her that day, they couldn't find anything. We saw no reason to charge it back up, so we just let the battery run out. Chris used to go in there sometimes and listen to her voicemail recording, just to hear her voice. When the battery finally died, sometimes I would catch him calling her number from his phone just to listen to her voicemail. I tried it once. I even started to leave her a message, but I couldn't find the words to say. I was always trying to be strong for Chris, to try and take care of everything so he could keep going. When I actually tried to speak about how I felt about everything, my words caught in my throat. I choked out a sob and cried until the voicemail reminded me I was leaving a message. Over the years, we tried to rebuild our life. But how do you go on without a vital part of your family? We checked ourselves into therapy, but the more we talked to our respective therapists, the bigger the distance between us seemed to grow. Some days, Chris didn't even speak to me. Sometimes when he looked at me, it was like I wasn't even there at all. Occasionally, I would wake up at night, only to find his side of the bed cold and unslept in. It was on those nights that I would find him standing in the doorway of Amy's room, just standing there, staring at nothing. "Chris?" I would ask every time. "Are you alright? Come back to bed." And then he would allow me to take his hand, close Amy's door, and lead him back to our room. There was one night I tried to go in there myself, just to see what Chris found so appealing. Immediately, I was unsettled. It was far too quiet in Amy's room. Everything in there had been untouched for years. Goosebumps broke out across my skin and a chill ran up my spine as soon as I stepped in. I felt frozen. Something in there didn't feel right. As soon as I was able to collect myself, I forced myself to leave the room, shutting the door firmly behind me. I talked to my therapist about how distant we had become. She told me it was common for relationships to become strained after the loss of a child. She suggested I keep trying, even if Chris wasn't receptive. To try to move past Amy's disappearance, I canceled her phone service. I was sure she wouldn't be coming back, but in hindsight, I shouldn't have done that. Chris had tried to call Amy's phone shortly after and exploded into a rage I had never seen before. He yelled and screamed at me so loudly, everything seemed to blend together. I couldn't make out anything he was actually saying. He threw his phone violently, causing it to shatter. I will admit though, it was nice to see Chris in a state other than the vacant place in his mind. My therapist recommended me that he was still grieving his missing daughter, but I was also grieving her too. It was important for me to try to keep both of us moving forward instead of staying stuck in the past. I was starting to feel more and more alone, isolated from the remains of my family. Chris seemed to want nothing to do with me anymore, and with Amy gone, I felt like a placeholder. I longed for the days when we felt like a family. With only my therapist to talk to, I found myself dreading the lonely nights at my house. I kept everything locked inside myself until my weekly therapy session, where I would simply just fall apart. I would cry and cry, babble on endlessly about how guilty I felt, and how I should have tried harder with Amy. I should have been more firm with her. I'd even said I thought I should have tried spoiling Amy. Maybe that would have improved things between us. I never wanted to replace her mother. Part of me didn't even want to be her mother. I just wanted us to get along. I wanted us to go on a vacation and have a good time, unlike when we went to Disney World and Amy sulked the whole time. How can you not like Disney World? Isn't it supposed to be the happiest place on earth? My therapist reassured me none of this was my fault. That as much as I tried to make things better, Amy would have needed to be receptive to my efforts. I often found myself wishing Chris would reassure me the way my therapist did. Sometimes I feel like he blames me for all of this. Nights alone were the worst. The police never outright said Amy died, but sometimes I felt like there was something else in the house with me. I often found myself feeling unnerved. I was terrified I would turn a corner and find myself face to face with Amy, or something worse. I tried to keep myself busy, so I wouldn't spend too much time thinking about Amy. I felt sick and my blood ran cold every time I tried to think about what could have happened to her. I knew something horrible had happened to her, but I had no proof. I felt completely helpless, so I tried to focus on healing my relationship with Chris instead. I knew a weekly date night was out of the question. It was a common solution for couples that had lost their spark, but Chris barely left the house anymore. So, I suggested a movie night every Friday night. Sometimes Chris would let me cuddle up to him. I think he was just humoring me though. He never seemed interested in whatever movie I put on. If I asked what he wanted to watch, he would just grunt at me. On what would have been Amy's 23rd birthday, Chris and I settled down to watch a movie, one of the Harry Potter movies. Since Chris never seemed to have an opinion anymore about anything, I chose something I thought would help me feel close to Amy again. She loved Harry Potter, and there were enough movies I could just cycle through them without getting too repetitive. Right as we started the movie, we heard something odd coming from deep in the house. My heart rate quickened as we paused the movie and looked at each other. Curiosity filled Chris's eyes as we followed the noise upstairs. It led us to Amy's room. Dread filled my stomach as we slowly pushed open her door. Somehow, the air in Amy's room felt quieter and stiller than normal. The screen on Amy's phone was lit up, even though the phone had been dead for years. She was receiving a phone call from unknown. I picked up the phone with shaking hands. My heart thundered in my chest, and I found myself unable to catch my breath. Hello? I choked out. A constant static noise came from the other end. My heart stopped, and I forgot to breathe for what felt like minutes before a voice answered on the other end.
Mom, Dad,
I gasped and dropped the phone in my fright. It bounced off the bed and landed on the floor between us. "Who is it?" Chris asked. He started to pick up the phone, but stopped when the voice spoke again.
Mom, Dad, are you there?
And then her voice just cut out. Loud static filled the room, drowning out any thoughts I had. And then, just as quickly as Amy's voice cut out, the static stopped too. The silence in the room hung heavy between us. Chris locked himself in our room. I started to make up on the bed on the couch, when something caught my eye, and I stopped. It was a gaudy picture frame, housing a photo of the three of us at the beach. It had sequin dragonflies glued to the edge of the frame. I had originally picked it up because Amy loved dragonflies when she was little. The memories came flooding back all at once, and I felt dizzy and nauseous. I sat down before I lost my balance. When Amy was 8, I had dragged her to a flea market to try and spend some time with her, much to her reluctance. Chris and I had just seriously begun dating, and Amy was not happy about it. Chris suggested I spend some time with her, and he assured me she would warm right up to me. I wasn't sure what to do with an 8-year-old girl, but I thought she might like to go shopping. A flea market had popped up that week, and I wanted to go out of curiosity. I picked up the picture frame, knowing Amy loved dragonflies, but she just snubbed me. The whole day she glared and rolled her eyes at me, clearly unhappy to be anywhere near me. Finally, I pleaded with her to just pick something out she didn't completely hate. She went back to the frame, picked it up, and shoved it at me. I paid for it and tried to ignore the apologetic, knowing smile the seller gave me. As we made our way back to the car, I stopped at a table wedged between a stand selling hats and scarves, and one selling homemade jams. Odd little trinkets covered the top of the table, and a bored-looking teenager sat behind it, more interested in her book than a potential customer. I can't explain it, but I just felt drawn to that table. My eyes scanned over the merchandise until they settled on what I somehow knew I had to have. My heartbeat thudded in my ears as I stared at it. A little leather-bound book, tied shut with a thin piece of rope. The teenager barely registered me when I handed her my money. When we got in the car, I turned to Amy and told her I would help her find a picture to go in the frame, if she wanted. She scoffed at me, glared again, and told me not to think she would ever call me Mom. I was so taken aback by this. I never heard such awful words come out of such a little girl's mouth before. I tried to explain that I wasn't trying to replace anyone, but she just sneered at me. We drove in silence. I dropped her off at Chris's house, and then hurried home. It started to rain, and the little book felt warm in my hands. Cautiously, I untied the rope that held it shut, and peeked inside. The pages were full of words and symbols I had never seen before. I couldn't make heads or tails of it at all, but I felt comfort when I looked at those pages. I flipped through them, studying the strange symbols on each one, until I stopped at a random page. I had absolutely no idea what I was looking at, but somehow, this part felt right. An idea popped into my head, and I started gathering things from around my house. Some candles, a bowl, a bottle of dark red wine, a little plastic dragonfly. I felt vaguely afraid that I was moving on my own, even though I didn't know what I was even doing. Somehow, my body knew to dim the lights, light the candle, Pour the wine in the bowl. Place the dragonfly near the bowl, as if on autopilot. Strange, inhumane words filled my head. I began to feel dizzy and lightheaded, like I'd had too much to drink, but I hadn't even touched the wine at all. I tried to stop myself. I knew what I was doing was wrong. The more I tried to stop, the more useless my efforts were. I felt like a puppet on a string. Fear pumped through my veins. The room suddenly felt too small, suffocating, and the threat of something bigger loomed over me. What was I doing? This was way out of my control. What if I opened a portal or summoned a monster? What if I killed someone? Frantic thoughts spiraled, overwhelming me. At some point, I passed out. When I awoke, wax had dripped down the candle and pooled on my table. I felt a pang of terror as I registered the room around me. The bowl was empty. The dragonfly was gone. The book was gone. What had I done? To this day, I have no idea what I did. I completely forgot about all those events until now. I think hearing Amy call me Mom may have triggered my memory, but I have no idea where she is. Since remembering, I've been sick with guilt. I can't eat or sleep, and some nights I find myself tiptoeing down the hall to Amy's room. As soon as I shut myself in, I'm overcome with grief. Did I do this to her? How could I do this if I didn't know what I was even doing? I went up to Amy's room one last time. I felt myself catch my breath, my heart skipping beats. I felt like I was just waiting for something to happen. Being in Amy's room put me on edge. I found myself looking a little too hard in the corners, ears straining to pick up the slightest sound. My hands felt clammy, and the room felt too warm, too stuffy. I jumped and let out a gasp as something caught my eye. The screen on Amy's phone was lit up again. I answered it, and was met with a loud growl of static. I threw the phone away from me and it bounced a couple of times on the floor. Something snarled and growled on the other end. I strained to listen, while every fiber of my being begged me to run the other way. This time, when I left the room, I locked it behind me. Chris probably wouldn't be too happy about that, but I felt being in that room put me in immediate danger. I don't know why Amy disappeared when she was 15, but I think it has something to do with that book, and the argument we had earlier that day. I scoured the internet and looked everywhere in my house for that book, but I've never been able to find it. Vanished without a trace. I don't know why it took so long for Amy to call, but wherever she is, I don't think she's still on this earth. My heart skips a beat every time my phone rings now. Sometimes I answer it, and I only find the hissing static on the other end.
Thanks for watching, Wolfpack. If you want to submit your story, my email and subreddit will be in the description below. And also, if you're not subscribed, please do if you want. And don't forget to like and comment as well. Have beautiful nightmares. And I will see you next time.